Welcome to Truth Unto Godliness. I'm your host, Michael, and today, for the first time, I will have a new guest on the channel, a quite intriguing man I have had the pleasure of knowing for now many years, and who is coming on live from Rome, the Eternal City, as it's known. Thank you so
Hello.
much, Father Lorenzo, for coming on this evening.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
And it's a pleasurable night in Rome. You came back from a cool evening jog, I
Yes,
heard.
it's well. I mean, as pleasurable as Roman summer nights go. I think we're still around the 20s, 30s. Don't know the exact temperature. It's 27 now, so 27 Celsius degrees. So as pleasurable as summer nights can get in Rome.
And it's a huge city. So do you just jog around inside the city, or do you have some parks available?
There's a nice cycling track in the area behind my house, and there are some nice trees there, so it's nice to jog there. As a matter of fact, I live about 30 minutes walking from St. Peter's. So
Oh wow!
if I were to follow the cycling track for 10 more minutes, I'd be able to see the dome, but I'm too lazy for that.
Indeed, and as all the listeners want to know, isn't it true that no matter which way you take, all of them would lead to Rome?
I reckon so. I mean, I'd hope so because I live here. So
Well, thank you so much for coming on here.
thank you.
And I just want to say also for the listeners, you speak English so well. So are you a native Italian or?
I am. My mother is a Roman, born of Romans. As a matter of fact, my grandfather was born in a building adjacent to St. Peter's, and my father's from southern Italy. So I'm 100% Italian as far as my genealogy goes.
That's amazing, and you speak English so much better than I do. Well,
Well, I
thank you so much,
appreciate it.
Father, for coming on. Do you want to introduce yourself a bit? I have known you for quite some years. I think we also met, actually, just as we're talking now, on a web chat at a group conference that was
Yes.
held during the COVID epidemic, where we also had some meetouts where I had the pleasure of meeting you and one of your good friends. But yeah, do you want to introduce yourself to the viewers?
Yes, I'll be very brief because I'm not that good with introductions, but I am Father Lorenzo Morone, and I co-pastor the Evangelical Lutheran Church Christus Victor in Rome. I say co-pastor because I'm a pastor with my dear brother and friend, best friend, Joshua Salas, Reverend Joshua Salas, who we share the ministry in that parish. And as you know, as we were saying, I'm an Italian convert to Lutheranism, so it's an interesting story there as well. I
Yeah,
mean, that's yeah. Go on, please.
yeah, no, yeah. So, did you grow up in a believing family, or do you come from a more secular background?
Well, I guess you could call it a sort of secularized Catholic environment. I was baptized. I did my confirmation, but my family wasn't necessarily going to church every Sunday. So it's the situation of a vast number of Italians, and I'd say probably Europeans, where you have a bit of a connection with the church, but it's not that kind of faithful, Roman Catholic adherence. It's more relaxed. And so that's sort of where I started. Matter of fact, my father is actually an atheist, but I never was an atheist. I took it more from my mother, who has always believed in God.
So, growing up as a, let's say, Christian cultural Roman Catholic, but never at any point a real secularist or an atheist. Would you say that as a young man, or even as a old child, and that you had some good experiences with the Roman Catholic Church? Because I suppose you were baptized, probably also confirmed. Were there any
Yes.
kind of catechesis in your teen years, or how were your experiences with the Roman Catholic Church before you began to consider yourself like a formal believing Christian?
Well, I mean, so catechization is a necessary step for both confirmation and First Communion. I was a bit of a weird case because in Italy, the tradition is to have First Communion and then confirmation. First Communion when you're like 8 years old and confirmation at early teen years. For whatever reason, I really did catechization only for confirmation and was sort of ushered into with my brother's first communion for whatever reason. I'm not really sure. So I did a bit of catechesis, but I wouldn't say that it gives you a good grounding in the Roman Catholic faith. Virtually every Roman Catholic in Italy has gone through catechesis because they wouldn't be able to commune otherwise, at least in theory. But it's mostly, especially at that young age, when you're 4, 5, 6, 7. What can you do more than telling maybe a few Bible stories and things of that sort? And many people don't even go to confirmation later, so they just stop at sort of first communion. So for many people, Christian education really does end when they're 10.
Wow,
So,
and no further catechesis is required prior to confirmation.
Well, no. No, it would be required for confirmation, but many don't get confirmed. Now, if you want to get married, you do have to be confirmed. So some people might choose to take that route of not getting confirmed in their early years, and then when they get married, do it. But that usually tends to be sort of a crash course in preparation for marriage, and confirmation almost becomes a sort of a side thing that you have to do it. But even there, when you're confirmed, I can't even remember how old I was, but I must have been around 13 years old. So, best case scenario, if you're catechized also with confirmation, when you reach your puberty is when you start detaching from catechesis.
Do you have any good experiences or memories from the studies or the catechesis you received prior to your first communion?
Well, my good experience are more sensory than intellectual, in the sense that whenever I enter a church and I smell incense or I see vestments, things of that sort, they bespeak home. In that sense, I have a good memory of my sort of connection with it. But frankly, I would like to say that I have any memory of my catechization, but I'm not a person with strong memory by myself, and that has happened so many years ago that I just have vague flashes. I don't remember enjoying it very much, but that was also because of it was a messy thing. You try to keep 20, 13-year-olds in a classroom, and
all the poor pastors that need to do that. Yes.
Yeah. Well, usually it's catechists. Usually it's not the priest. It's the catechist who does it. Yeah.
Yes, because in the Lutheran State Church, it's almost the same situation. It is by and large also mostly a cultural institution nowadays, and but the vast majority of ordained are a part of it and also receive the sacraments there, baptism and confirmation. And there's also a small obligatory catechesis leading up to confirmation in Denmark. And yeah, some places it's quite good. Most places it's totally meaningless, and it depends. But here there's a tradition that it's always the pastor who does the catechesis himself. But yeah, so growing up with this background and not really identifying or practicing your Christian belief, what led you back to the I will say as Lutheran, since you're baptized, what led you back to those baptismal graces, and what rekindled your faith again?
Yes, well, there was a middle step, which is that during my sort of mid to late teen years, I started getting very much interested in Eastern philosophies. Now, when you're 16, I think, is the age when in Italian high school you start studying philosophy, and you start, of course, from the Greeks. So you have, pre-Socratics, and then Socrates and Plato. As you have to think, for me, I was doing Plato on the one hand, and then I was getting interested into these Eastern philosophies on the other. It was like bombarding with ideas. And my as you might imagine, my connection with the church, with the Roman Catholic Church, had never been particularly strong. And so during those years, I sort of left it off entirely. There was a brief time when I was interested in Eastern Orthodoxy, but eventually, during my later teen years, I started being more interested in these Eastern practices. I started trying out meditation and things of that sort. Then the thing that brought me back to Christianity, ironically enough, was when through these sort of Eastern interests, one of the things I stumbled across are near-death experiences. I don't know if you know them, if you're familiar with them.
Yes, I've heard so, and my mother was very much into New Age spirituality,
Right.
so she would share with me, and I picked up some things. Yes.
Right. And one of the things I noticed, I started sort of reading some of these reports of these stories, and one of the things I noticed about these experiences was that Jesus was always a recurring figure. Like you have to search really hard to find Muhammad or Buddha. You have a few experiences out there. And that sort of goaded me in the direction of thinking, okay, well, maybe this Jesus guy then is probably more important than the other ones.
Interesting.
And I remember I was dozing off once in class, and I remember making exactly this thought. I was thinking, hey, this Jesus guy probably is a step above the others. And I was around, 17, I think, at the time. And so that I sort of start approaching Christianity once again. And at the time, I was thinking to myself, what branch of Christianity? And the answer at the time that I was sort of familiar with were Roman Catholicism and Evangelicalism. And my thought at the time was, well, for the Roman Catholics, you're saved even if you're an evangelical. So I'd rather go with the evangelicals. The whole reasoning is silly if you think about it in hindsight. But I was a teenager, and so that's sort of what drew me back into, shall I say, Christian Orthodoxy. But it was a very vague thing. On the one hand, evangelicalism did leave some heavy, negative scars. The same things you hear from American evangelicals of how, it's very law-centered and stuff. But at the same time, I wasn't taking it very seriously. I wasn't particularly concerned with Christian living or things of that sort.
Just to pause and take a step back. So you become interested in Eastern philosophy, near-death experiences, and from these you gain an interest in Christianity in particular, because it seems to be a recurring theme, and especially the figure of Christ himself appearing in many of these near-death experiences.
Yes.
But how did you live in Rome at this point?
I've always lived in Rome since 2005, since I was 7, because before that I spent 4 years in Nuremberg and was actually born in North Italy. So, but I don't have any Northern Italian blood. No. It was just the place where I was born.
Okay, so living in Rome, but so I mean, I'm speaking from a very Danish point of view here, and a lot of viewers on this channel are probably from America or England or even some from Brazil as well. We don't really we think of Italy as a very monolithic Roman Catholic country. How widespread is evangelicalism in Italy and in Rome? How is that on the radar for average Italians? Because I would think my presupposition would just be that if somebody considers Christianity in Rome or in Italy in general, then the ubiquitous nature of the Roman Catholic Church would make that more or less the only relevant or available choice. But it sounded here as if you really had you had multiple options available for you.
No, in Italy, evangelicalism is a very slim sliver of the population. It must be 2%. The reason why it was present in my view is because at the time I was already consuming mostly English language material, even on near-death experiences. And so I was exposed to the world of, American evangelicalism, as a matter of fact, more than Italian evangelicalism in a certain way. So that's where the evangelicalism comes from. No, it's very much minority.
Did you come across any English-speaking Roman Catholic apologetic material? Because I remember not many. I think 2 years or 2 years after I became a Christian, I came across Catholic Answers and consumed a lot of their material. Was that also something you considered as well, or?
No, but at the time I wasn't very sort of attuned with internet apologetics. I followed a bit on Islam because that had been for a short time on my radar, wondering if Islam was the way to go. But at the time I wasn't really, I wasn't on social media. If you look at my Facebook account, it's actually very recent. So yeah, it wasn't really on my radar at the time.
So was it more or less coincidence that you came across evangelical material online and then tried to find some venue as well in real life?
Well, I guess that if you look at religious material in English, it's not hard to miss. In Italian, of course, you'd have to look for it. But the moment you start consuming material in English, it's very easy to come across evangelicalism.
Yes.
In the religious sphere, of course.
Yeah.
But just to be clear, I didn't start attending an evangelical church. I was at the time actually sort of going to the Anglican church here. And that's actually where I met my best friend and currently colleague, Father Joshua Salas. That's where we met, and that's a story for another day, I suppose. But I was sort of a very committed evangelical, even worshipping in that church. I wasn't even like a pedo-Baptist at the time. I was credo-Baptist, so I wasn't really even an evangelical Anglican. I was just sort of like a charismatic or a Baptist, but worshipping in an Anglican church.
Would you say that you slowly grew into Christianity over a period of time? Because it sounds like it was maybe the conclusion of a longer part of time where you had a growing interest and wanted to discover and explore these options more, coming from, let's say, a position of being more so an inquirer, having been spoked by curiosity and an interest in philosophical arguments and near-death experiences. Or was there maybe a point or some experience, or do you remember some particular event where you, for example, began to pray again, or began to maybe identify yourself as a believing Christian, or was it just like you slid into it? Like how did that take place?
So certainly the intellectual side, perhaps I should say that way, was a gradual growth. Also because at the time of my conversion experience, and I'll tell you about that in a moment, I was preparing my dissertation and my MA dissertation, and that was in historical Jesus studies. So I was getting very much into New Testament stuff. But I actually had also a conversion experience on the 15th of March, 2018. Oh. So it's sort of of course, as a Lutheran now, you look back at that and you don't exactly know what to do with it. But I sort of see it as, in my personal life, as the moment where things really started going in a certain direction.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I did have a conversion experience, yes.
What made you choose that thesis to write on, on the resurrection? You wrote your master's thesis on the resurrection, or?
Sorry, did I say MA? I meant BA. Pardon me.
Oh,
BA.
yes.
Sorry.
Your bachelor thesis.
Bachelor thesis.
What made you choose that particular topic?
Well, I was interested in historical Jesus studies. I had already been interested in a while, while in high school. Ironically, I'd come across the subject thanks to Bart Ehrman. But the dissertation itself was actually sort of a critical piece criticizing the methodology of historical Jesus studies and how they're actually using contradictory methods very often. I would have to review it to give you a more detailed description because it's been so long, but yeah.
But was it also inspired in part because you wanted to ascertain whether or not he rose from the dead, or was it more academic, a more cool, detached academic interest, or did you also feel that you had something at stake there in that question?
Ironically, I never doubted the resurrection of Jesus. Even during my more sort of Eastern New Age stuff age, I never doubted that Jesus had risen from the dead. So I had never had a personal sort of need to ascertain it. Of course, looking at it as then how old was I when I graduated? I think 20 years old, I don't remember. But looking as a 20-year-old young man, and you look at this academic world where most academics will hardly believe anything written in the Gospels. Yes, of course, that does carry much weight. And then you have, some Roman Catholics saying that Jesus wasn't physically raised. As a matter of fact, in 2018, while I was in this Anglican church, the guy who had sent as an ambassador for the Canterbury Diocese to the Holy See, sort of came under a bit of a scandal because 10 years prior he had preached a sermon saying that Jesus was not physically raised from the dead, or at least intimating that there was a bit of a controversy there. So long story short, for personal confirmation, no. But interest in the historicity of the Gospels for the sake of sort of confirming it to others, yes, I was very much interested in that.
Okay, and all these different considerations, all these interesting steps on this intellectual journey of development, did not mean necessarily that you began to cultivate an interior religious life or anything.
Well, I mean, it depends on which side of the conversion experience we're talking about.
Just prior to it, yeah.
Prior to that, as I was saying, I wasn't taking my faith very seriously. I was, kind of reading the Bible a bit, but it wasn't this sort of. I didn't do, say, the liturgy of the hours, or even have a regular, prayer life. As a matter of fact, I'd say probably before becoming a Lutheran, I had a very messed up theology of prayer, even to begin with. It took me a very long time to develop regular prayer, and I still struggle with it sometimes. It's one of the most difficult parts of being a pastor, I suppose. You give me the Greek, the Hebrew, I don't care for that stuff. It's fine, but you have to pray. That becomes the hard part. Anyway.
So what happened when you had an experience? Would you mind sharing that with us?
Well, I mean, it wasn't actually preceded. It was almost like a Luther Tower experience kind of thing, because it was preceded. I had just broken up with my then girlfriend. Okay, so I was already in a sort of vulnerable emotional state, and I had been in 3 days of just absolute depression. Maybe not clinically, but like deep sadness, because I knew that God was far, and I had absolutely no idea how to get to him. I remember even having dreams about this and waking up and feeling this pressure on my chest, because I knew that God is so big and so immense, and yet so far. And then one of these days I was reading the letter to the Hebrews, and particularly chapter 4, the verses 14 through 16, that talk about how we have the high priest, and therefore we can approach the throne of grace with confidence. And at the time, that sort of took me for a moment. But it wasn't when I had the conversion experience. When I had the conversion experience was, I think, a couple of days later, that I was again still in this deep gloom. And And so after dinner, I started praying, and I was in utter despair. And all of a sudden, it sort of came to mind. Those verses came to mind. I said, wait, so Jesus' blood has opened the doors to heaven for me to access God and call on him. And then I remembered, Jesus being a man and therefore being sympathizing with us, all those things. Of course, the thoughts don't necessarily rush in an orderly manner. But anyway, so that sort of was like a light turning on. It's like, And it was a very intense experience at the time. Of course, looking back to it today, there was probably a lot of emotionalism, but probably that was the first time in my life I actually understood the gospel.
Well, that's beautiful. I do think that God, who knows us so well, also knows how to speak and approach us, and he will use many different people. He will use so many different means, also emotional experiences. I remember too that becoming Christian for a long time for me was something merely intellectual, something I believed, also strongly believed, and I was very much convinced. But it wasn't really a living, active faith. I didn't pray. I didn't. There was no real struggle with sin. I was very much at peace with my habitual sins back then, and so on. But I also remember how that began to change in having these experiences of awe, for example, like being very moved at a service, or trying to pray and have a feeling of God's presence. And I think those experiences can be very important, especially in the beginning of one's Christian life, or help cultivate it, because you are really reaching out towards something, and you don't really know like where to grasp onto. So God will show himself. I'm thinking about the story of Moses. Like, you will get to see a glimpse of the back of God and experience some of the beauty, some of the joy, some of the peace as well, so that even though the rest of your Christian journey won't be this emotional experience, and indeed you shouldn't chase these experiences, then you have felt this love, and you seek it out and yearn for it, which I think is, I think it's wise and speaks to God's wisdom as well, that he will use all sorts of means to reach us.
Yeah, most definitely.
And so you had this experience while and then. And were you attending the Anglican Church at that period?
Yes.
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 Okay.
Yeah. I had started attending just a little before.
Yes. How did you find the Anglican Church in Rome?
As another funny story, I was following an English course at the time, and just out of curiosity, I started going a couple of times, and eventually I liked it and sort of stayed.
Okay.
It's a very nice church. I mean, architecturally, they have a very good choir, excellent organists. So, I mean, it does give a very good impression from that point of view. Yes.
Just out of curiosity, I suppose most of the parishioners are not native Italians.
No. It's a cultural enclave. It's not really meant to be an outreach evangelism thing for Italians.
Did you share your experience with the pastor there, or was he somebody that you also spoke with and talked with, or was he more distant?
So I did talk a bit with the pastor, especially with the new one. Not necessarily not necessarily always with positive terms. And I was 20 at the time, and I wasn't necessarily always the most polite person to interact with. Have I ever told him about my conversion experience in particular? That's actually an interesting question. I don't think so, but I wouldn't be able to tell you 100%.
No. Yeah. So time passed, and did you find other Christians or that you could meet with, for example, in many evangelical circles, as of course you are aware, and as most listeners might also be very much aware of, it's normal to congregate also outside of church in Bible studies or different types of small groups where you're able to to find also Christian groups outside the church to help cultivate a religious life, because I think one of the most difficult things for me was moving from being convinced of Christianity to actually being a living, practicing Christian, because I didn't know any Christians. I began attending the state church services a bit, but there was no sort of like social social community outside the narrow confines of the service itself. And I did enjoy those services, but it was very difficult to be a Christian alone, especially one that is more conservative in belief. And it was only much later that I came more or less by coincidence across some youth groups that really began to change for me.
Yeah. Well, at first, I started this friendship with this with Father Joshua, and in many ways he wasn't, it still is sort of my primary point of reference in terms of our spiritual life, our ministry. I'd say around 3 months after my conversion, we started becoming friends with a Baptist pastor not too far from the Anglican Church. If you've seen photos or the video of the ordination that occurred a couple of months ago, that was in that Baptist church. Because we started having a friendship with them, and that was back in 2018. So now it's been 7 years. And we started sort of attending their potluck lunches, having a bit of fellowship with them, staying for their Bible studies, and that sort of kept us going basically until COVID. So that was, yeah.
And that Baptist church, is that I assume that particular church does a lot of outreach. Is it mostly a congregation of native Italians or foreigners who live in Italy, or what's the composition of the Baptist church?
Well, that church in particular is very mixed. There is sort of an elderly Italian contingent, but then you have newer, younger generations who are mostly foreigners from many parts of the world. You have Latin America, you have Eastern Europe, Africa. And it's sort of in a way also the same in our church. In our parish in particular, I'm trying to think, but I think I'm the only Italian in our parish. Wow. But we all, speak Italian. We all live in Italy, so it's a heterogeneous. Sorry, not homogeneous. The other thing, heterogeneous group, and that includes also the Baptists. If you're not Roman Catholic, you have to expect to be either an ethnic minority, like sort of the Muslims or the Hindus, or you're going to be a very mixed group.
Yes. So you began attending as well this Baptist church in the Bible studies, some of the social options that they had available. How did you come across Lutheranism? Because I could imagine a situation where you would have ended up being a Baptist.
Yeah. Well, my first contact with Lutheranism was through stuff like Lutheran satire, these things. And that was a long time before even meeting these Baptists, probably even a long time before my conversion experience. Some of those videos float around. And so I knew that they were out there. I knew that they existed. Gesundheit. I knew that they existed. But I started taking them a bit more seriously, I'd say around 6 months into my conversion, into my faith, because I came across a few videos by Pastor Fisk, Jonathan Fisk at the time. And remember, I had just finished my BA in New Testament, and now I was starting an MA with an eye more for church fathers. So I was right in the depths, sort of, so to speak, of that ancient Christianity. So on the one hand, I'm hearing Lutheran teaching. On the other hand, I'm reading the New Testament and the Fathers, and the first thing that strikes me is quite obviously baptism saves, and the body and the Eucharist is Jesus' body and blood. You know, I looked at the New Testament, the Church Fathers, and I said, yeah, that's quite obvious. Other aspects of Lutheranism, I wasn't that convinced at the time, and so I sort of incorporated some things and not others. And I sort of stayed in that situation for until COVID. So I'd say roughly a year.
Did you, in this year period, did you begin to reconsider Roman Catholicism? Because, I mean, I had a similar experience where, having become a Christian, having found it was also like a more charismatic, low church congregation I began attending called Vineyard. So, and what led me out of that was, just as you said, I began reading the Church Fathers for the first time. I was struck about how clear and more or less uniform the reception and understanding of the sacraments were among the Church Fathers, and the importance of the sacred ministry and the importance of liturgy and services and so on. And I found that very much to contradict this more, what shall we say, way less formal, low church expression of Christianity. And that led me not to consider Lutheranism, but that led me to consider Roman Catholicism and made me begin to attend Roman Catholic Mass. But it didn't quite move you that far. I'm hearing you say.
Ironically, I'd say that reading the Fathers kept me away from Roman Catholicism. And I don't mean it as sort of a punchline or something, but like literally, I was reading the Fathers and saying, okay, well, there is no Pope here in the first 300 years. There is no, the devotion to the saints. I actually dedicated my MA dissertation to that, the development of the veneration of saints. It was very different, it has a very different shape in the early ages. So I was not particularly enticed by Rome because I just couldn't see a lot of those things in the Fathers, especially early Fathers, of course. The Fathers is a generalization, but yeah.
Interesting, but it did begin to sway you more towards the Lutheran side, but you were not wholly convinced. And then COVID happens, Rome closes down, all of Europe closes down. All of us have a lot of time on our hands. Luckily, thank God, I lived on a farm when COVID came. So I just had a very long vacation, a lot of time outside. We came through it very, very unaffected, I must say. But living in such a large metropolis as you, I imagine it was quite difficult with social distance and how it. Yeah. So how was that? Did you think? Was it just the extra time that allowed you to dive deeper into some of these issues, or what happened with you during COVID?
Well, actually, during COVID, I entered another phase of despondency, I suppose you can call it. I was once again that's I don't know why. Maybe because I'm very obtuse and stupid, but God usually makes the best things happen to me after He carries me through extremely distressing seasons of life. I don't know why he enjoys doing that. But anyway, and so I sort of realized that just sacramental realism by itself wasn't a sufficient comfort, because if you have sacramental realism but you don't have law and gospel, and you don't have proper idea of how assurance works, it doesn't matter. I mean, it still gets you pretty down. And so I started actually locking in on Lutheranism, because I thought, hey, the more I listen to this Lutheran stuff, the more I see it, and the less despondent I am. And so, to put it very briefly, over a brief period of time, I was sort of delving more deeply, and eventually I reached out to Pastor Fisk himself, and he sort of sent me across a few people, and eventually we started having meetings here, very irregular at first, and then eventually we had a parish.
When you say meetings, who did you meet with, and were you put in contact with Lutherans in Rome, or how did that work?
Well, there were no confessional Lutherans in Rome. There are two Lutheran parishes, but they're sort of, one is German and one is Swedish, and they're both very, at least I wouldn't say very liberal because I don't know them personally, but they belong to that sort of branch of the Lutheran tradition. No, what happened was I was put in contact with Dr. John Bombaro, who at the time was working in the Eurasia region. And he put me in contact with Michael and Nancy Maurizios, who are missionaries here. They still are. They are lay missionaries in the country of Italy. And so we met with them, both myself and Joshua, because of course, Joshua would deserve an interview of his own. He's less active on social media, but his personal experience is even more interesting than mine. But so we met with them. And we started by going out. There was another brother from Padua who also was he was raised confessional Lutheran, then returned to the faith as an adult. And so we started having these meetings, sometimes just to have a service of the word because we didn't have any pastor. Sometimes we could have a pastor come around, either Pastor Serene from Romania or someone else, depending on the circumstances. And we were able to have Holy Communion. But at the time, it was a very sort of informal, irregular thing. We met in an Airbnb at near the Colosseum, so it wasn't a congregation, properly speaking. But that was sort of the start of the whole thing.
Was there some particular point where you said, nah, I'm convinced of the Lutheran confessions as a valid, true expression of Holy Scripture, because you begin to explore sacramentalism, but you also find that even if you have, let's say, like sacramental realism, then that on its own isn't comfortable. But I think that presupposes in a way that you're already convinced of, let's say, some of the other Lutheran main points, such as, for example, the necessity of knowing assurance of the salvation and so on. So you study online, you come across Lutheran resources online. Was there some particular point where you say, okay, yeah, I'm a Lutheran now, I've become convinced, or did you consider yourself exploring these options still when you began to meet up with other Lutherans in Rome?
Yes, I'd say in many ways I grew into it. Some parts of the Book of Concord I read after my confirmation, so the large catechism or the small called articles, those more substantial things. So it certainly is sort of certainly growing into it. But at the time, of course, that I became a member, that I became communion, because of course we didn't have a church body, so technically you couldn't become a member, but that I started receiving communion, I had, sort of the basic ideas of the small catechism or Luther's 20 questions that were very clear to me. And I said, yeah, that's exactly what I believe. But in that sense, I suppose, but I don't think there ever was a day when I said, no, from today onward, I'll be Lutheran. In a way, I mean, I like to think of myself as just Christian, and I know this idea is super abused, but I really do think that what I'm doing here is being a Christian minister. I mean, that's really what I'm doing is offering the gospel of Jesus Christ, and I'm not here to quibble over scholastic philosophy.
Did you at some point reach out to your old church, or did some of them reach out to you? Because I mean, there was of course a natural pause during COVID when everything more or less is closed down, but then there must also have been a point where, I don't know, did you reach out and or did you just stop coming to the, for example, the Anglican services or the Baptist services? Or?
So we left, Joshua and I left the Anglican Church before COVID with what can be euphemistically termed a very strongly worded email on my part. Because I mean, it's it's very much in line with the Church of England. So it really wasn't a suitable home for us.
Mm.
So in that sense, yes, we did leave the Anglican Church earlier than COVID. As far as the Baptist Church is concerned, we were never members there to begin with. So we had always been guests, sympathizers, in a way. And sometimes we still attend their potluck lunches and things of that sort. They're nice people. That when we told the pastor there that we'd found this Lutheran church, he was super excited. He's a very nice guy. He was very encouraging. So in many ways, we didn't join them to begin with, as in membership. But we had established a bond of friendship, I suppose. But of course, we told them, because of this friendship and this openness, they were very much aware of where we were in terms of our spiritual growth. Yes.
So after a couple of years with meeting other Lutherans, for example, also visiting pastors from Romania and these lay missionaries who are staying in Italy, how did it come about that this? I mean, there must be a point where an actual parish or a structure somewhat similar to that was formed more formally in Rome. So how did that?
Well, that's actually, so the parish itself is formed. The formation of the sort of church body as a whole is still in process, because we still have to establish our governing organs. That's still a work in progress. As far as the parish is concerned, yes, we started, basically the LCMS sent us a missionary. So we started meeting at his house for a while, a missionary pastor, of course, ordained missionary. And we started meeting at his house at first, but then eventually Josh and I said, hey, we have this gorgeous church in the center of Rome, the friends of ours. And why don't we ask them if we could use it? And of course they said yes. Of course, we pay a rent, so it's not like we do it for free. But the degree of friendship is such that they would be willing to let us use it for free if necessary. And so we started worshiping there. Officially, the parish was opened in January 2024, so just a year ago. Of course, unofficially, as I was saying, we were meeting already, but and so for about a year, slightly more than a year, this parish was sort of served by this LCMS missionary, and then eventually, Joshua and I were ordained, and so we now serve there.
Yeah, and can you put a few words on that? So you also began receiving more formal theological training. What led you into, first of all, ascertaining whether the holy ministry was something you wanted to enter into, and how was the calling process and the ordination? I saw some beautiful pictures from the ordination service as well. What led up to that beautiful day?
So, as far as personal calling is concerned, I suppose in a way, I remember telling my mother when I was a young kid, if I don't get married, I'm going to be a priest. So I suppose in a way, I had always been interested in the job, if I can put it that way. And one of the things that actually had us leave the Anglican Church was us considering ministry, because of course the same with Joshua. And, seeing that wasn't a suitable venue for us to work in holy ministry. So in terms of personal calling, I'd say probably it grew. It wasn't like a moment when I said, I feel called to the holy ministry. I'd say this was probably more of a process over time. As far as the process itself, so since we don't have a proper church body, some of the things were a bit sort of had to be, how can I say, we had to find solutions for it. So, for example, we don't have a seminary here. And so education was handled through Riga Luther Academy, which is this both online and in-person seminary centered in Riga, Latvia. Same thing with the calling process. It was sort of a vague question, in the sense that, of course, we had to have a call, and the congregation sort of confirmed the call. But even there, it wasn't like we didn't have voting or things of that sort. It was, I dare to say, a more informal procedure. Also because we technically don't have parish members. We don't have, it's still sort of underway. What I mean by parish members, I mean, of course, we have people attending the church, but we don't have like a proper roster saying this is a member, therefore they have the right to vote. This is a guest, therefore they cannot vote. That's still a sort of a process.
I think we can take comfort in that also being a later development. I don't imagine that St. Paul would write to Timothy, please bring me back the membership roster of the Corinthian church, because I need to write out some names.
Yeah. So yes, in many ways it was informal. And then eventually, we came to ordination. We reached out to the mission diocese and asked if the Bishop Pohjola was interested. Johanna Pohjola had the desire and the willingness to sort of oversee our ordination. And so there was that as well. There was a process of sort of, well, first of all, of establishing a church order, so establishing a few basic ideas of how we work together, then having an examination, so, which ultimately was a private conversation with the bishop, because we don't have a consistory. So that would usually be handled by the consistory, but of course, in our case, we don't have a consistory. And then eventually, we came to ordination, and that was it. That was 2 months ago.
And when you said the mission province of Sweden, that is all?
No, diocese of Finland.
Oh, right. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Yes. Wonderful. And so, I just want to ask you. I suppose this is the great question. How are we to do church in Rome in 2025? Because, I mean, all of Europe is horribly plagued by secularism, the loss of meaning, the loss of community and belonging, both nationally, but especially also religiously. And there's been such a fragmentation. And I think the gravest difficulty here in Europe, at least in Denmark, would just be the profound apathy towards religion. It's not so much that people are convinced atheists or have a deep-seated will against religion. So it's just that they truly don't care for it. They don't find it necessary. They don't want to talk about it. They shy away from it, not out of spite or hostility, but just out of skepticism and apathy, really. So how do you reach your countrymen today in Rome?
Oh, I think that's a very loaded question. I would say that Catholic Europe has an additional problem. At least I see it in Italy. I wouldn't be able to judge for countries like Spain and Portugal, but I would dare to think that it's similar. That, ironically, we don't have a very long history of, say, for example, biblical knowledge. So you think, for example, about the English-speaking world, both the US and England, and you have a very solid biblical basis, because you have the King James Bible, you have the Book of Common Prayer, so you have a very rigid biblical foundation. In Italy, at least, the foundation for most of people's religion is what sociologists usually term pietà popolare, popular piety, which is a concept that is in a way almost foreign to Protestant countries, and yet it's foundational to understand so much of even Pope Francis's ministry, or even many theologians. It's this sort of amalgamation of the Mass, devotion for the saints, private prayers. And so you come to this country where people are very much not familiar with the Bible, somewhat familiar with the liturgy. I would say that the biggest risk as a confessional Lutheran, and it might sound almost how do you say, paradoxical, but you take sort of a sympathizer, someone who's interested, and you slap the Book of Concord in their face. This person hardly knows what a Bible is. You tell them, please go to Matthew, and they'll open the Old Testament. Maybe not that bad, but very bad. It can get very confusing. So I'd say that probably and I say it with almost zero experience because I'm 27. I mean, I was born yesterday, basically. But if I'm asked my opinion, I think that the key is starting from Holy Scripture. Holy Scripture, and I'd say perhaps the liturgy as a hook, as a latch to bring them to Holy Scripture. Because the thing is this, even if people are not familiar with the Bible, most people have a Bible at home. They never read it. They have no idea what it contains. But that means that if I tell them John 3:16 says this, they can still go home and check it and open it and reread it and read the context. For example, I host in Italian a podcast where I explain the liturgy. And the other day I was explaining the Gloria in Excelsis, which of course is that beautiful sentence, peace on earth and goodwill to men. And I explained basically the whole gospel, starting from that sentence. So you see, you take a verse that is both biblical and liturgical, and you can expand into Lutheran teaching. I have a feeling that if we go to them and say, well, according to Augustana 4, for them it's too foreign to grasp at first. So I'd say probably from an intellectual point of view, you want to start from the Bible.
But do you find the Bible to be sufficiently, what can I say, relevant might be too strong of a word, but does the Bible speak to modern Italians today? Do they care for it, or because I mean, if I've tried to share some scriptural thing with the average Dane, most people, unless it's something interesting or specifically relevant to let's say the discussion we're having or something, it just seems like this very dusty old esoteric book. It doesn't really speak to people that much in Denmark. But is the reception, is there a greater openness towards maybe the scripture or religion in general in Italy?
I think you have to apply a bit of discernment. So Paul is going to be more controversial than Jesus. Virtually every Italian, even atheists, have a reverential respect for Jesus. So if I take the Sermon on the Mount, virtually everyone's going, at least intellectually, to assent to it and say, yes, that's good stuff. Now, of course, living it out is a different story.
Yes.
But at least they won't be, sort of attacking it. Of course, if you go with portions of the Old Testament or again St. Paul, it might be a bit more sort of, you have to get there.
Yes.
But if you can use the Gospels, the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, I think that's a huge start. And of course, you can delve deeper into, because then you can say, hey, Jesus was a Jew. You see this thing he says, it's actually a reflection of this book from the Old Testament, and sort of expand into it. Of course, there are varying degrees. Someone who's a sympathizer is not at the same level as someone who's been there for 30 years. But I'd say probably from the intellectual point of view, That's a starting point. Of course, there is another side, which is the personal, sort of relational aspect. And one of the things people need the most and lack the most in churches is fellowship.
Yes.
And so spending time together, and it doesn't have to be reading the Bible, although of course it's good, but even going out for dinner and getting to know each other, having a certain degree of vulnerability to each other, that gives you a great head start, because in most Roman Catholic parishes, people just don't even know their neighbor's name.
Right. Yeah, that really speaks to me. I think that like honest, genuine friendship and community are some of the most valuable treasures that we Christians have to offer, at least Western Europe today, because these things are so sorely lacking. Where more and more we become increasingly fragmented and isolated and alone, and these sort of substitutes for community, whether it's online fellowship or whether it's a distraction or escapism through the consumption of media or whatever it might be, they really don't satisfy the longings of modern man. So to find friendship, to find people who earnestly care for you, like, well, not care for you, in a physical sense, but they think about you, they're interested in you, they have your good in view, and want to help you. I think that was what created the largest impression upon me when I found for the first time a living Christian community. That it was the honestness and the genuineness of the friendliness of these people. They didn't try to lure me into like, oh, join our sect or something. They just they really cared for me, and they loved me, and that was amazing. I had not really experienced anything like that before, and that really drew me in. And I think that is a very concrete and not easy to do, but easy in beginning to do. It's really something we need to challenge ourselves to practice more, because everyone can do it. It's not necessarily easy to do consistently, but it's possible for all of us to do, and that is really a way to manifest the gospel message, and to reflect God's love and ultimate His care for us in having us live out that reality to our neighbor.
Yeah.
I think I also wanted to add, do you think that having been a pastor new now for 2 months, you said?
Yes.
I think I need to call you in again in 10 months, because the first year is just, you have to figure out so many things. But if you would just for a moment entertain this, if I called you, for example, in 10 months, having been a pastor for a year, what do you hope to do as a pastor, as a servant of the servants of Christ in Rome? What do you want to do, and what do you plan to do in trying to reach out to the inhabitants of Rome?
So I think hopefully we'll be able to start courses for people who are interested. That is an idea that has been sort of floating in my brain for a while. To have something that is non-committal, so not something not catechesis per se, but something for people who are interested to sort of figure out what's happening. In terms of direct outreach, I think most of it would be on social media, because, I mean, I suppose you can leave leaflets around. One thing we like to do is singing in our parish. We sing very well, and I don't like to boast, but we sing very well in our parish, and we're not many, and yet we sing very well. So one thing could be, inviting people for a Christmas mass where we sing the whole time. I think something of that sort. But I think the two things that sort of reach out the most are word of mouth and social media. I wish it wasn't that way, because those are things you can't control. You can sit on a soapbox in a plaza and just shout. Of course, you can do that, but most people are not gonna approach you. Most of the times, I would say, is probably either the internet or word of mouth.
Yes. Wonderful. If anyone wants to learn some more about you, the parish, or maybe even if they want to help somehow, however that might be, how can they reach out to you, and how may they assist in any way?
Well, I mean, our parish has a Facebook page. I didn't. It's called Christus Victor Roma, Roma, which is of course the name of Rome in Italian. And you can follow us there. You also have the personal contacts of both myself and Father Joshua if you're interested. As far as helping is concerned, well, I mean, Joshua and I don't get paid, so it's free labor. But at the moment, I think the best thing would be to pray for us. Probably in 10 months, that would be another of the things we'd like to set up, being able to sort of not get paid, but sort of be able to manage a few finances here and there. But for the time being, just pray for us, pray for me, pray for Joshua and for our parish here, and and then stay in touch, and hopefully we'll be able to share more as we grow.
Thank you so much, Father Lorenzo, for your time. Do you have any final thoughts or something before we leave off for tonight?
No, I mean, my final thought was pray for us, but I've already said it. So.
Well, thank you so much, and I will certainly let that exhortation go out to all of you listeners here today. Please pray for the faithful church in Rome, and I will also pray that God will bless, especially you and Father Joshua and your parish as well as the whole city and country of Italy, because it's dearly loved by God, and I pray that He will use especially you and your parish to reach out with the life-saving gospel to all those millions of people who live just around in Rome. So thank you so much, and God bless you, Lorenzo. And for you listeners, thank you for watching. I hope you have enjoyed this conversation, and I hope that it will serve as truth unto godliness. Goodbye.